you everyone for being here. This is Anissa Avon, and welcome to Best Practice Presentations, Effective Business, Sales, and Technical Presentations. We are eager to get started, and we're super excited that you're here. I always like to start on time, so we're going to proceed. And I want to give you guys just a little bit of background about our webinars. We are sponsored by the Whitmarsh Consulting Group. They are a group whose entire focus is best practices in human resources. You can find more about David Whitmarsh and his unique group of experts at bestpracticeinhr.com or wcg-bp.com. A little bit about myself and our organization. TurnKey Coaching Solutions is a global employee development firm. We focus on enterprise learning and development. Our main objective is to support our clients in driving enterprise learning and development solutions throughout their organization with consistency and driving business results and improving organizational culture. We've been in business since 2004 and have been in the industry since '97. So I'm proud today to introduce you to one of our master trainers, Duncan. Alan has been working with us for a couple of years now, and I'm super excited that we're able to present his knowledge on presentation skills. He takes this content all over the world, training leaders and training groups on delivering not only great presentations, but also technical presentations, sales presentations, business presentations. He has over 25 years of learning and development experience and has worked with many Fortune 500 and Financial Times 100 companies worldwide. He works in the capacity as management coaching, executive coaching, team development, communication, maximizing your sales team, and of course in developing really great persuasive presentation skills. So Alan, I'm going to hand this baby over to you. Tell us all what makes you the expert here.
All right, thanks very much, Anissa. First, I need to adjust my headset here because my head's getting bigger with that introduction. Let me acknowledge everybody on this webinar for taking the time out of your busy day to participate here. Clearly, I have a group of lifelong learners, and you are committed to extracting value from your time here, and I'm committed to delivering it. So what might be of use to you, since the question was what qualifies me to talk to you, is that my history with presentations goes back to the early 80s, where I worked on the oil patch. And I raised venture capital for drilling funds. So I would have to go to venture capital individuals, investor groups, insurance managers, and anybody with a dollar back in the 80s to convince them to put money down holes in the ground. So I learned to make all the classic mistakes that you would imagine are still pretty obvious out there. One is you're talking too much. And if you've ever talked your way into a sale and then talked your way right back out again, it's probably because a lack of structure there. So my background then goes back to, excuse me just a second. Oh, there we go. So my background goes all the way back to the early 80s here. And I've been a corporate trainer since 1989, where I started to learn how to do it right. I was hired by a company called Achieve Global. They were a worldwide training organization, and I learned from the best. So first learning from my mistakes, then learning from the best, qualified myself to the point where a company here in Houston, Anadarko Petroleum Company, they called me in 2003 and asked me to design a program for business and technical personnel. So they were tasked me with 3 objectives for those posts. When I say personnel, I'm talking about everything from petrophysicists to accountants through lawyers and engineers. And what they tasked me with was building a program, and I'm going to deliver this to you today, an efficient process, because people were spending way too much time building these horrific data dumps. And you see that currently now with the overuse of PowerPoint, where by slide number 23, you're slipping into a coma. So an efficient process is on offer here today. An effective, simple flowchart structure I'll introduce you to as well, which will keep you on track and discourage you from going flying off on tangents. And of course, for the time we have left for question and answer, I have a plethora of delivery tips for you. The agenda for this, right? So my belief is that the piece coming up next, the meat of this presentation, is the design and delivery process, the design and development process, which has proven to be a huge time saver. So that's where I see the meat coming in, as I just mentioned, as much time as we have for delivery tips we'll put in there. You've set aside, as we have, an hour for this. There will be handouts that will be available to you probably about halfway through the webinar. We're not sending them right now because I don't want you to read ahead. Stay with me, you'll get maximum value. But do anticipate receiving this slide deck as well as some job aids to support you with this. All right then. Have you ever been to a presentation where you noticed the only one enjoying the presentation was the one delivering it? Well, if you've experienced that, it's probably because there was a lack of consideration to, what type of presentation is the audience expecting. And there are three types of presentation in my view. The speaker-focused presentation is one where you might be entertained, but a week later you can barely remember the topic. Sometimes motivational speakers are guilty of this. You feel warm and fuzzy for a few hours, but after that, what are you left with? Now, the other extreme, where I often see in technical companies that I work with, is the content-focused presentation, otherwise known as the mind-numbing data dump. So we have to be considerate of how we present technical information. The type of presentation that I'm recommending would include, of course, engagement, entertainment to a degree, and certainly solid content, but the whole presentation should be designed to deliver value to the audience. So when it comes to value, then the consideration has to be is if you're sitting in an audience, why would you pay attention to the speaker? Well, there are three types of objectives, all of which are designed to cause some kind of positive change in your audience. So if you want to change the body of knowledge your audience is working with, so they can make a more informed decision perhaps, your goal is to educate or inform. Now, if you want to change their minds about something and have them perhaps be open to new ideas or an upcoming change that might be seen as disruptive, you want to convince them it's a good idea. And if you want your audience to actually do something as a result of your presentation, like approve your budget or greenlight your project or buy whatever you're selling, whether it be a product, service, or an idea, your goal needs to be motivate. Now, the question might come up then, well, Alan, can you have all three objectives in your presentation? Well, the short answer to that is yes, you can. And it's very, very important to have a clear objective as stated as a benefit to the audience here. Now, I'm sure you all have your personal objectives when you're delivering a presentation. One is not to, well, I have two personal objectives. One is not to lose my mind halfway through. And secondly is not to go flying off on a tangent. So I have to be very careful and well organized so that I'm not tempted to engage in either one of those. And what I'm doing is I'm listening for Anissa to say, Alan, we have some questions here. And if you're using the chat room, which I hope you are, Anissa will be looking for themes or specific questions that, given the timing of the webinar, will be most useful for the audience. She's going to interrupt me.
Absolutely. One of the things I want to put an asterisk on is if you've been to any of our webinars before, we absolutely want this to be a presentation that directly addresses any questions or concerns or ideas that you have regarding your skill set or what you want to know about best practices in presentations. So please do submit your questions. At the moment, my screen is frozen. So Sheila is going to be helping us monitor that chat box and those Q&As, but we definitely want your involvement. So don't hesitate to let us know how we can make this presentation address some of your questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Anissa. Now, for the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to be outlining three areas, elements, or aspects of presentations: design, delivery, and development. And I'm going to talk you through in that order. The design phase is otherwise known as pre-work. So this is what we do, according to best practice. This is what we do before we actually sit down to build the thing. And when I say build the presentation, I'm not talking necessarily about building a slide deck. So strictly speaking, a slide deck is not a presentation unless I'm sitting out in Singapore and you email it to me. I'm talking about the point where you are in front of your audience here. Before you get to that point, we must consider several things. Number one, who's in the audience? What do they already know about the topic? What would they need to know about the topic? Who are the decision makers in there? Because I will confess, in one presentation in particular, I had 15 engineers in the audience and one vice president. I'll confess that my entire presentation was geared towards the VP. He was the person making the decision. So think about your audience then. Objectives, as aforementioned, objectives for the audience. So not necessarily your personal objectives here. What is the benefit or the advantage, or give them a reason to pay attention to you. And then key points. Now, at this stage in development, this is a pre-development process. Really, I'm thinking I might have a flip chart as I do here in my office, and I might sketch out or throw a half a dozen or a dozen points up there that I want to cover in order to achieve the objective, knowing that very soon here, I'm going to be building an agenda. But these are, I'm basically brainstorming myself to think about. So Marcy's asking if she's going to get the PowerPoint. Yes, you are, Marcy. And there is a couple of points where I recommend you take notes. And that's really in this next slide. So let me move over and I'll talk about logistics when we get there, since you asked about receiving this. Now, in the principle that you're 7 times more likely to remember something if you write it down, then I'm going to recommend, if you have a pen and paper handy, is to take a note of that right-hand column here. So to recap briefly on the pre-development process, think about the audience. Who are they? What do they already know? Why are they there? And that will lead, the why are you there will lead you into being able to articulate a clear reason for them to pay attention. So for this webinar, if you recall, the advantage of you spending time in here is that you're going to learn those 3 things. You're going to learn a process, you're going to be introduced to a structure, and you're going to get loads of delivery tips as we go. When it comes to agenda points, the recommendation for a 10 to 15 minute presentation or even a lunch and learn is you organize it into ideally 3 chunks, probably no more than 5 agenda points. And why? Well, it has to do with the attention span of the adult human and the ability to retain information. Now, we can hold quite easily 5 points or 5 ideas in our short-term memory. We can very easily hold on to 3 points. So if there's one major benefit I would say from this slide is have you thinking about, structure your presentation around 3 key messages. They're very easy to remember, and it's a bit of a magic number. So you see a couple of examples there, past, present, and future. I saw a good one of those at the oil company aforementioned here, where the presentation was about the past, present, and future of petroleum exploration. For engineers, it's what's the current situation, what problem will we address, what solution? And then, of course, you have a simple 3-point agenda. Now, if you're doing a whole day training session, that's another conversation altogether. This is a 10 to 15 minute presentation, which is really about the extent of the attention span of the adult human currently. All right, point number 4. Yes, go ahead, please.
On the identify the key points.
Yeah.
So is it accurate then for every 15 minutes of a presentation, you could introduce another 3 key points, or if it's an hour presentation and you really have a lot of data to cover, you're still recommending no more than 3 to 5 for that presentation? All
right. Well, the scary part in your question is when you have a lot of data to cover, is that you've got to make it palatable for the audience. So I would still recommend, even for a lunch and learn, I'll develop 3 15-minute chunks. And within those 15-minute chunks, I'm not going to have any more than three core messages. Is that helpful?
It's very helpful. Yes, and it also reminds me of if anyone on the call has ever done any media training. When you do media training, they want you to have these sound bites, and this is very similar to that. Whatever the message is, what I just took away from that, whatever the message is that we're trying to get across, we're really still looking for key takeaways. No more than 3 is the attention span, and that goes for segments as well as an overall presentation.
Yeah,
so that's very helpful.
Yeah, well, there you go. I worked with a phone company in North Carolina last year, and they showed me what they lovingly called a capabilities presentation, which was basically a horrendous data dump. but their last slide had a list of 8 reasons to buy from that company. I say, nobody's going to remember this. There's not a chance you're going to remember 8 things. Heck, how many times did it help so let's make assumption on some of the how we were raised here. Certainly in Scotland, we were sent to Sunday school every morning, and I remember what a horrendous task it was to remember the 10 Commandments. So right now, I don't remember the 10 Commandments, but I remember the 3 important ones.
Yes.
All right, before I get myself into trouble here, let me move on and talk about logistics. So again, key points. 3 is a magic word. When it comes to logistics, here's my main message on this piece. Don't be the presenter who spends the first 5 minutes of their presentation wrestling with their laptop trying to get their slide deck to work. Plan ahead. Find out about the venue. Determine what kind of equipment's available to you. A lot of companies are shifting from projecting on screens to having monitors in their conference rooms. Monitors don't reflect your laser pointer. So you might have to use animation to bring in key points as you go, as opposed to using the laser to zero in on the part you want to look at. But again, the logistics point here, the main point here is plan ahead. My basic principle is to be ready to present before the first audience member shows up. That way I'm standing there or sitting there relaxed, and I can put my focus on the audience members rather than be freaking out because I can't get my slide deck to work.
This is a perfect key point on the planning logistics, Alan. We spent probably about $1,500 one time or more planning for a big presentation, and I get there and my cord for the presentation and their technology didn't work. So from this point on, I carry a huge bag of cords just in case.
Right, there you go. Okay, so point made, hopefully taken. Thank you very much. All right, let me move on and show you a simple flowchart structure. So once you've done this pre-work, you've thought about the audience, you've determined objectives, you've organized yourself roughly into key points there, you're thinking about your agenda. I'm going to show you the delivery structure and process and flow, and then I'm going to talk you through how to develop a presentation, which I think personally believe is worth the price of admission to this webinar here, or more, should I say, worth the price of your time investment, I should say. So let me move on here. It's a flowchart. Engineers love it. It's very, very simple. The ancient Greeks knew that presentations had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and what you're seeing here is exactly that. What I have to offer you is a little bit, some more nuance here and a substructure to make your presentation highly effective, keep your audience engaged, and also leave time for interaction as we go. Your opening statement then, so let's assume we're talking about a 10 to 15 minute presentation. Your opening statement shouldn't take more than about a minute. And you've seen this from me already, right? Background. It might be your personal background if people don't know you. It might be the background which led you to this presentation. B, in this case, could also start for business rationale. What is the company reason for having this presentation or this meeting? Your objective then, it's stated as terms of benefit to the audience, and then a clear agenda so the audience knows when you're going to get to the piece that they're most interested in. This way you don't get questions out of turn and have to say, well, I'm going to get to that in a minute. Can you hold your questions to the end? Using the structure I'm going to show you here and the process, you should never have to be concerned about that because the audience knows when to ask the question. Timing's very important as well. Don't drop that out. Don't assume everybody read the memo or the email before your presentation. Let people know how long it's going to last. So we know that, and I know we have another 40 minutes here, so we have enough time to really delve into this in a little bit more depth. Opening statements are huge. When it comes to managing nervousness, and I might just bring that in at this point. If you notice that the times when, and if you're human, you're going to get nervous in stressful situations. And for many of us, making presentations are one of those stressful times. And we're scared about making a mess of it and screwing it and looking like an idiot and really ruining our entire career on a 10-minute presentation. You will have noticed then that the anticipation and fear of making a mess of things usually happens before the presentation, and sometimes that first minute can be really scary. You walk in front of the room and everybody's looking at you with pregnant anticipation. You'll also have noticed probably is once you get over that hump and get into the meat of your presentation, in other words, your comfort zone, you calm down and you're fine. So I'm kind of hoping that somebody's on the chat room is responding to this as a verification that it's not just me. I get nervous about presentations with folks that I consider are above my pay grade, and those fears come to me as well. But frankly, I welcome that feeling. And frankly, I had it last night. Sitting watching TV, and I had this wave of nervousness just pour through me about screwing up this webinar. I kid you not. I expect it, and frankly, I welcome it before the presentation, because I would rather let go and be able to recreate that fear and just let it flow through me, because I know that I'm well prepared. And if you're well prepared, don't be castigating yourself for being nervous. If you're human, you're going to get nervous. Your opening statement, this is probably the only piece I script. I might script my opening statement and my closing statement, because that's the pieces where I want to really get a clear message across. And once you get past that first minute and you get into the meat of the presentation, you'll feel a lot more relaxed. If you get that minute down cold, you're in great shape. All right, so there is the acronym BOAT, background, objective, agenda, timing. It's the best acronym I've been able to come up with. It's a lot easier to remember than TOBA or ATOB. But the point of the matter is, it doesn't have to be delivered in that order. In fact, starting with the objective can be very, very valuable. It's just like on Shark Tank, if you watch that show, the people always start off with sharks. We want $1.7 million for 5% of our company. Get the objective out very, very soon. If your background or business rationale for your presentation is going to run longer than 10 or 15 seconds, then change the order and put background after timing. All right, moving on then. Substructure for all your agenda points. It doesn't get much more simple than this. You say something to introduce the agenda point. And that's what I did earlier when I said, have you ever been to a presentation where you notice the only one enjoying the presentation was the one delivering it? So I would imagine that most, if not all of you, started thinking about presentations where you've been in that situation. And what that did was it allowed me to open your mind to what was coming next, which were types of presentation and objectives. And then I bridged into the next point and by asking for questions at that point. So you've already seen those first two steps in action. Using this structure then, the rest of your presentation flows simply using those structure. Unless somebody's seen this webinar or been through the program, nobody knows you're doing it. They just know that you look organized, you look structured, you look like you're there to deliver value. And then when it comes to your closing statement, you summarize those key points you want the audience to remember. It's 3 reasons to buy, 3 reasons to change their mind, or enough for them to remember in the short term if it's an educational piece. Now you'll see question and answer down there, or questions or comments. The truth of the matter is that the research tells us that the attention span of the adult human is shrinking. So I recommend stopping at the bridges and asking the question, what questions or comments do you have before I move on to my second point? And then you count to 10 seconds like I just did to allow time for the audience to formalize a question and raise their hand. All right, more on delivery tips later. Blended a couple in that there showing the structure, but there's your simple flow chart. It doesn't get much more simple than that.
This is very helpful, Alan.
Yeah.
One thing I was going to share is that one of the best pieces of advice I ever received during my presentation and facilitator training was actually from Jack Canfield. Way back in my 20s, I took the Train the Trainer program from him. He's the best-selling author of Chicken Soup for the Soul.
Right.
And he said that the way he would structure every single one of his presentations was very similar to this. And if we break down each of the key points, he would say the best way to think about your key points is in the sandwich format. So you're going to tell them what you want to tell them. So you want to tell them what you want them to know. Then you're going to present the relevant information. Then you're going to tell them what you just told them. So the buns of each key point is a singular 1 or 2 sentence maximum soundbite.
Right.
That then becomes what they typically will take away. So you've repeated the key point before you move into the next with these very quick, memorable agenda points, like the Sharks, I'm going to ask you to invest 1.7 million. Here's all the relevant information as to why. Sharks, who wants to invest 1.7 million? And I find that sandwich methodology to be very helpful when I really only have a limited amount of time to get my point across.
Yes, it's a great process for delivery, but it's a trap. It's a trap when it comes to the development of your presentations, because one of the biggest mistakes, well, the two of the biggest mistakes that people make in corporate America when it comes to developing a presentation is step number one, oh, got to make a presentation. Fire up the PowerPoint template. And second mistake is let's start at the beginning and work our way through. So although this process of delivery is simple and elegant, it is a trap because it leads you to those two biggest mistakes, starting with a deck and starting with your opening statement. And if you've ever sat there at 11 o'clock at night on slide number 23 thinking you might have overdone it a little bit, or you end up with a slide deck and realize, boy, I've got to cut half of this out. Or if you've had to rewrite your opening statement several times until you were happy with it, it's because you were doing it, and I'm going to assert this, you were doing it in the wrong order. So let me run with your sandwich analogy here, because if you look at this process, yeah, you can see this as a sandwich. Your opening and closing are your slices of bread, and what's in the middle is your bacon, lettuce, and tomato. And since it's lunchtime here, I'm imagining some of you might be sitting with a sandwich right now. And not that I'm going to take sandwich orders and deliver them to you. You're getting the slide deck and you're getting a handout, but you're not getting a sandwich delivered. But now you're thinking about a sandwich. I just wonder what kind of sandwich you're thinking about. Because when I ask this question, seldom do I hear, what kind of sandwich, Alan? Well, I think I'd like a wheat toast sandwich today. No. I'll tell you what, we're downtown. I would like a ciabatta bread sandwich. You know what? I never hear that when I'm asking people what they want for lunch. What I hear is, well, I want a ham sandwich. I want a BLT, right? I want a turkey sandwich. And if you're catching on to the analogy, when it comes to the development of your presentation, you start with the meat and don't worry too much about the garnish, that's your slide deck, and your slices of bread, which are opening and closing statements. So here's what I think this next piece coming up is what I would assert is worth the investment of your time. If you get nothing out of this next piece could make a huge difference for you. All right, so here's the development process. And once you've given consideration to the audience, you've determined objectives, you've got several ideas that you want to build into your presentation, you start with the meat of your presentation, which indeed are your agenda points. And the substructure to the agenda point is say something to introduce the topic, like you ever been to a presentation where you wish the guy just emailed you his slide deck, and then present the relevant information as you've heard me do, and then bridge into either questions or the next topic. Now, sequencing, there's several ideas in sequencing. I'm always recommending 3, past, present, and future. You know, image, productivity, financial. So if there are any salespeople on the call or sales managers on the call, every business or even every department in the business has fundamentally 3 sets of needs. One is image. You know, how do we look in the marketplace? How do we appear to existing customers? Internally as well, you know, what's morale like here? So every business has an image need to some degree. We also have second needs, productivity. You know, we want to be more effective, we're more efficient. And third is financial. We're in business to make money. So if I was structuring a presentation, a sales presentation, I would be thinking about what are my prospective customers' needs in those 3 areas: image, productivity, and finance. So I'll chuck that piece in for the salespeople in the group. Now, once I've organized my presentation, I've thought about, you know, those 3 parts to building the body. And by the way, all of this is coming to you in a handout, so you don't have to remember this piece. Start with the meat of your presentation. Get them in a logical sequence. Prepare to stop for pauses or question and answer at bridges. Step number 4 is a no-brainer now, because you know it's gone before. It shouldn't take you more than a minute or 2 to write a closing statement, which would summarize the key message is you wanted to deliver. And at that point, your opening statement is a one-off. You know what you're going to introduce, right? What's background or business rationale? What's the objective from the point of view of the audience? What's your agenda? And how long is this going to take? And at what point can we ask question and answer? Those first 5 steps There's a very simple 4-letter word that I associate with those 5 steps. It starts with a P, it ends with an A, and it's got a line in the middle. It's a presentation plan. Start with a plan. What a concept. So I'm sorry I have to laugh at this, because I swear to God, after the hundreds of people I train, and I just got through training summer interns at a couple of oil and gas companies here in Houston, and I swear they were all making the classic mistake, starting with the slide deck. Slides come in.
I am super excited that you've developed a handout that everyone's going to get, because I will say that it's going to be difficult to break the habit of not starting with the slide deck.
Yeah, that's your comfort zone. Yeah, that's the comfort zone. And that will be my caution at the end of this webinar, is that you're more likely to fall back in your default position next time you have a webinar to run or a presentation to develop than following this process. But I have to tell you that the reason that I'm still, after 16 years, running this program at Anadarko, it's not just because they commissioned me to develop it, it's because they've all seen that they've saved inordinate amounts of time with the development process. So if there's one key message here, well, there's really 2 key messages in this webinar. One is your presentation is about the audience. It's not about you and what you want to tell them. An audience-focused presentation is there to deliver value. So that's if you forget everything else I say, that's the one big issue, is it's about value to the audience. And that way, you know, if you get nervous halfway through, or you skip a slide, you make a mistake, and you start having a conversation with yourself about how it's going, if you remind yourself to say, hey, I'm no longer running an audience-focused presentation. If your focus is on yourself in that presentation, then you've lost the primary purpose of the thing, which is deliver value to the audience. So negative self-talk isn't going to help you. Just the same thing with positive self-talk, because I'll confess to, if I'm making this presentation or running a training session and I get a laugh from the audience, you know, I'm up in my mental control room going, oh, that was good, Alan. That was a funny story. Tell him another one. Right. And then I turn into that guy. You know, the one. The only one enjoying the thing. So first 5 steps, develop a plan. And this, you're going to have a 1-page handout that after the run about now, I guess Sheila might send it to you. Your first 5 steps is a plan. Sketch it out first. Then add visual aids to your plan. That way you only put up there as a visual aid what's going to support and help the audience, not as speaker notes for yourself. All right, so there's your first 6 steps. Now I should assert then, before people have seen this process and applied it and seen the value, is that most people, I would assert, and maybe most of you, is that once you have your slide deck put together, you believe that you're ready to make the presentation. Now, I would assert for many of you that's step number 1, and there is no step number 2. Using this structure and process, first 5 steps, get a plan, then add visual aids, and then you're still not done. Because there's a 7th step in this process, and that is to loop right back to the start of your whole thought process and think about your audience again. All right, so who's coming to the audience? Given my objective, where might the challenges come from? You know, which teams or groups in the audience might not be interested as much in the topic as other groups? You know, who's going to be skeptical, right? Prepare for your engineers out there. God love them. They're the ones that will ask the challenging questions. Where are the misunderstandings you might have to address? Or rumors that you're going to have to clear up? And who's flat not going to like the idea? So at step number 7, then, there's 4 potential challenges: disinterest, doubt, misunderstandings, and dislikes. Using this process, you don't have an option, but be prepared for them. You do have an option as to how you handle it, though. You can either wait for somebody to raise their hand and challenge you with a skeptical question, or a challenge about your objective, or not like the idea. At that point, you can either wait for the hand to rise up, or you might actually plan to build it right into your presentation, right into your opening statement. So, for example, if my presentation to you had to deal with, you know, I wanted to motivate you to change and change a process, or maybe bring on a new piece of software, like another adaptation of SAP or something, which everybody would be thrilled about. I might be thinking about, okay, at this point, I'm thinking, all right, who's not going to like the idea? You know, who's not going to like the idea? Sheila. Sheila's not going to like this because it's going to mean extra work for Sheila and her team. So I can either wait for Sheila to raise her hand and complain, or I might build it right into my opening state by saying, you know, folks, given my objective here, this is going to be a major change for the organization, but I don't want you to lose sight of the fact that this is going to cause some disruption for Sheila and her team. And Sheila, I appreciate you being in this presentation here. I know you're open to the possibility here, but don't want this to be a waste of time. My intent in this presentation there is to try to outweigh the short-term disruption for you and your people with the longer-term benefits to the organization. So I appreciate your patience. So you might choose to do that, but there's anticipating challenges. Don't be blindsided. Don't be surprised. If again, and I always plan for engineers, given most of the presentations I make, is that, and I'll have in my appendix, which is, I'll have a slide deck, I've got 15 slides in there maybe. The appendix is all the other slides after my closing slide, and they're there to bring forward if somebody has a challenge and I want to bring back the research or the formulae that brought me to my conclusion. All right, so it's probably a good idea for me to stop talking here for a few seconds and get some questions on what I've covered so far, because what's coming next are delivery tips. So what are you seeing in the chat room, Anissa?
Nothing yet in the chat room. I am curious, though, for those of you who are listening. One of the things that you had mentioned, Alan, was something that I certainly struggle with, and that is when, in fact, I do open the PowerPoint and use that as my means for structuring this presentation, I may end up in a 15-minute presentation having 30, 40 slides, right? And
Yes.
so then I try to go back and whittle it down. And I'm curious how many of you on the webinar experience something similar, having to whittle it down, or the opposite. How many of you have 3 and think, gosh, I really need to add some meat to this? I'm curious what others experience in that regards. And also, if you have questions about the structure and what's been shared so far, please, this is a perfect opportunity to give us some feedback or to ask your questions. So in your experience, Alan, though, how many people that you end up coaching and using this training with have that same problem? They are addicted to PowerPoint, they end up having too many, and they have to whittle it down.
Thank you. All right, well, the 2 points there, not having enough, is that, and frankly, I can't remember anybody ever asking me that about, do I have enough slides? It's usually the other way around. It's usually, so my answer is less is more. And if you feel the necessity to have, you know, several layers deep of justification for your point of view, I recommend you present the first level and put levels 2 and 3, if not maybe a half a dozen slides in the back of your presentation. And what I mean back of the presentation, I'll take my cover page and copy and paste it at the end of the slides that I plan to deliver. But I might have a half a dozen or a dozen other slides in what I'll call the appendix that I can bring forward if I need to address a particular concern. So bottom line to that one is less is more. If you come up with a plan, then you'll recognize in that process, the presentation isn't the slide deck. In fact, one of the most powerful things that you can do when you're delivering a presentation is to actually blank the screen. And you can do that by hitting B on your keyboard. It'll blank your screen, and for question and answer, that might be an advantage because then people aren't distracted by your slide. So before I go flying off on a tangent, Anissa, did that to some degree answer your question?
It does. It absolutely does. And a couple of folks have responded as well. Sharon wrote, I always have to whittle down, and the value in that is I have information in my mind that can be included spontaneously as it may be relevant to answer questions. I'm always aware of not having too many slides, not making the slide show my whole presentation. I tend to use graphics rather than words as possible. Do you find that others find that to be helpful? They will over-create, and then they have access to the additional should questions come up. And is that helpful as a general rule?
Yeah, you know, the number one complaint in corporate America when it comes to presentations is people standing there reading a slide deck at you. And if you don't if you don't build a plan first before adding visual aids, you're more likely to fall into the trap of having too much on the slide. Because if step number 6, add visual aids, is step number 1 for everybody else, that's not using this process, then that's the danger, is you end up putting everything you want to say up there. Whereas you're much better, keeping it at the back of your slide if you need to bring it forward. But focus on the audience. I mean, it shouldn't be, if the slide deck is the thing, email me the darn thing. What value do you add to your presentation? And I don't know about you, but I've been to a lot of presentations that should have been emails. I just wonder, what am I sitting here for? Look, we can read 3 times faster than anybody on this webinar can talk, including me. So if you slap a bunch of slap up on the slide, people are going to read ahead. So that's why in the next piece I'm going to talk about is the use of visual aids here.
Well, this is really helpful because this also leads us right into Carolyn's question. She says, I know you're speaking about new topics for an audience, but how do you make annual trainings interesting when they're mandatory? How does your process apply to those situations?
Okay, all right. When it comes to training, then we've got to make a distinction here between presentation and training. The big difference between a presentation and a training session is that in training, the audience is doing something, not just taking in information. And that's the big mistake that some trainers make if they think the presentation is the training. I mean, the training provides information, but will it cause behavior change? So let me give you a classic example of this, is that there's what's called, there's safety and environmental presentations that are compulsory to be delivered every year. If you just imagine out in the Gulf of Mexico, those platforms, the people that are pumping oil out the ground for us, out in the Gulf of Mexico. And every year they must, by law, listen to the presentation on safety and environment. And so I had the privilege of training a group of people, actually 2 different companies brought me in to do this, train their trainers in making those presentations more interesting. So the first thing I did was, well, okay, let me show me what you have so far. So this fella got up and he fired up his slide deck, and his first slide was a picture of him sitting in what they call the doghouse out on the platform where a lot of the controls are. And he's basically got his feet up on the desk and he's asleep. And the opening statement from that individual is that, okay, there's me out in the doghouse, and that's where you're going to be in about 5 minutes with this presentation, because I know you've seen it 20 times before. And I'm sitting there going, oh my goodness gracious. So here's the big difference, is that once they understood that a training isn't a presentation, I recommended they try an experiment. And the experiment was, look, you've got to slide your way through this module. You got a manual to go with it. You got a bunch of slides. Why don't you do this? Why don't you organize the audience into groups of 2 and 3, break down the presentation, and task everybody in the audience with delivering it? Are you getting the idea now? So in other words, the trainer turned into a facilitator, and he gave everybody, a few pages of the manual and a few slides to prepare, and they had to come back and deliver. Do you know what? It was magic. They had a good laugh with it. They got the point across, they internalized the content, and it made a huge difference. And they're still doing that today on Anadarko platforms out in the Gulf. So that was a kind of a long answer to the short question, but the big message there is the difference between a presentation and a training is that the audience is actually doing something.
And if it's in fact an annual meeting where it's not a training, it is a presentation, this idea around making sure that the key points and the structure and the plan is in place is still relevant, even if it's not a new topic for the audience.
Right. So here's what you do then in that case, right? At the bridges, you stop after each point and say, right, guys, what experience have you had since the last time you saw this presentation that would be relevant to this particular aspect?
Brilliant.
All right. And you don't start talking there. You ask that question and you count in your head for 10 seconds. And you don't make it a closed question like, do you have any questions before I move on? Because nobody's going to raise their hand. And we've all seen that from most presenters. They go, so any questions? Nope, thanks very much. No, you say, what questions or comments do you have on this piece before I move on to the next point? 7, 8, 9, 10. And the pressure of the silence, which you as the presenter have control of, the pressure of the silence will probably pressure somebody else to raise their hand and ask a question. So make it interactive to make it interesting.
Excellent.
All right. So far, so good?
So far, so good.
All right, thank you very much. And by the way, this slide, not only are you going to get it as a slide deck, but you're going to get it as a handout. So if you're taking notes, it's in addition to what you're seeing here. All right, I'm ready to move on to the next slide. What I will do as soon as my button works.
Is it going to let you?
No, if you've still got control, go ahead and move it on.
All right, I'm going to do that.
Yeah. Okay, visual aids. There we go. So there are several options. Look, don't be enslaved by PowerPoint. You know, sometimes using a flip chart or a whiteboard, if you're building a process or talking through a formula, sometimes it's better to actually be a more organic process, and it's more engaging for the audience. So don't be a slave, as I say, to the PowerPoint here. Handouts are useful to make your point, as long as you don't give them out immediately right off the front, like this handout. We didn't get off at the start of the program. You'll get it, probably have it by now, or certainly in a few minutes to give you access. And also for technical presentations, frankly, I'd rather see the actual valve than a picture of the valve. So be a bit creative with your visual aids and don't necessarily be dependent on PowerPoint. But since it's people would be shocked sometimes if you show up for a presentation and you didn't have a PowerPoint slide deck, let me give you some tips on that. And I've got probably top 10 tips coming your way on how to use the PowerPoint. Now, it still looks to me like, here we go. I think, did I get control? Do I have control here, or was that you? Here are your tips. Tip number 1. Whoever it is, it's working. Maybe it's just right, here we go. Use a template with a sharp color contrast. So watch out if you're using these Microsoft PowerPoint templates, just because they're available doesn't make them good. So light green on a white background tends to wash out. My big tip with this is that your slide deck is always going to look better on your laptop than it does on a projected screen or a monitor. So make sure you've got a good sharp contrast. Tip number 2, don't get too fancy by using the same type of font that you would see in a book or a workbook. No wings or sans serif fonts are recommended. And you notice the Arial, Calibri, Verdana, these are all examples. In fact, Verdana and Helvetica were actually developed for PowerPoint. They're just easier to read. They're not too fancy. For those of you who don't have a choice, project a screenshot or an Excel spreadsheet, those are the worst. So you might consider having a handout for the audience to support your slide and bring it in so that they have a chance to actually read and see what's there. Tip number 4, keep your slide deck simple. Use consistent heading. Don't get too fancy like this slide right here. A lot of entertainment on there. So keep focused, keep the audience focused, but don't put too much distraction up there. And consistent headers are one of those things that are useful, especially if the audience wants you to go back to a slide. You know, can you go back to the development slide, Alan? Well, I'll know exactly where you want to go there. So consistent headers are helpful. All right, rule of 4 and 4 when projecting bullet points. Now, strictly speaking, this isn't a rule, it's a guideline. And the rule of 4 and 4 suggests is that don't project more than 4 bullet points at a time and don't have more than 4 words on your bullet. So looking at this list here, well, there's a little bit more than 4 and 4 on this list, right? So I've shown you 5 here, but I brought them in one at a time. And when I brought in each one, I paused for a couple or 3 seconds, and the time it took me to read it is about how long it took you to read it. So that's what's called clearing the slide. So following the rule of 4 and 4, it's not a rule, it's a guideline. Only project enough for the audience to take in 3 or 4 seconds, during which time you are silent. Take a breath in and out. It's 3 or 4 seconds. If you keep talking while those slides are coming up, you're creating a conflict of interest. And most of us, what we're going to do, are we going to listen to you or listen to me or read the slide? Well, more than 85% of us, according to neuro-linguistic programming or NLP rather, we think in pictures. So we're more likely to read the slide than listen to you. So don't create a conflict. Okay, here's a big tip for you. Is that given that the #1 complaint in corporate America is somebody reading a slide at you, is position your laptop as a teleprompter. You know, bring a desk down the front if you're in a U shape or in an audience there. And if you have a lectern, You know, position the lectern so you can glance at it, not stand behind it like you're in the pulpit. Position your laptop as a teleprompter to help keep you on track. All right, fade transitions. That's what you're seeing on this deck, right? If this is a business or a technical presentation, you don't want to be using fancy animation and fancy transitions, you know, where the page folds up into a bird and flies off the screen, as with origami. See, you're all going to want to see what origami looks like. I'm not going to show it to you, but when you get on your own slide deck, scroll down for origami, you'll see what not to do. Keep it simple, keep it conservative for business, technical, and sales presentations. All right, animation, as you're seeing here, is to control audience focus. Guys, if I'd have brought this top 10 list up, I would still be talking about tip number 3 when you're at tip number 10, waiting for me to catch up with you. So animation, the purpose of animation is to control audience focus. And don't feel obligated to have a slide up for your whole presentation. Don't hide behind or in front of your slides. You can use that B button to blanket during Q&A as an example. You'll get the audience's attention. But if you see people doing the iPhone prayer under the table, if you're sitting at a conference room, you know, when they start looking down, their hands are in their lap. Yeah, they're not praying. They're checking their messages. That's the point where you turn your slide in. Don't be surprised everybody perks up. All right, last tip on this one. Slides are visual aids for the purpose of satisfying your objective by providing value to the audience, not as your speaker notes. If you want speaker notes, print them out as a handout for yourself, 3, 6, or 9 on a page. All right. So there are my PowerPoint tips. Being conscious of the time here. I figured I got maybe 3 minutes. So I'm going to throw some brief tips in here and then leave the last 5 minutes for Anissa to handle or ask me a question and answer. All right, so let me just talk you through around the clock here, starting with fear. I've already addressed this issue. 2 points on fear is don't resist it. What you resist persists. When the fear comes through, just let it throw through you. And if it's before the presentation, say thank you very much. And when it's during the presentation, it's usually because you aren't prepared enough. So if you get a question you weren't anticipating, don't forget, you're in charge of the time. Take 10, well, give me a moment to think about that. You know, usually in about 10 seconds, the answer will come up to you. All right, when it comes to visual, you've just seen several tips. When it comes to personal, get out from behind the lectern. Videotape yourself for practice purposes. Everybody has a video camera now. Videotape yourself and be looking for distracting mannerisms like rocking back and forward on your feet or throwing your arms around. Usually that it's a nervous displacement activity to get rid of that energy from the adrenaline. So videotape yourself. When it comes to verbal, 2 things on verbal. More and more organizations are multicultural, I'm finding. So be conscious of the fact that English is not everybody's first language. And English is one of the 2 most difficult languages to learn. Why? Because we've got 20 different ways to say one thing that might be said in German. The second thing is watch out for your TLA. You know, if you bring up TLA and you're talking about TLAs, you know, and nobody knows what the heck you're talking about, they're going to tune out. So make sure that you translate your TLA into the 3-letter acronym you intended. All right, when it comes to vocal, take pauses, plan for your pauses. If you're a fast talker like myself, you know, what I actually do is plan to stop talking from time to time. And I do that at the bridges for sure, where I stop for 10 seconds. I say, what questions do you have? Stop for 10 seconds and then get it. And then when it comes to audience interaction, don't engage in one-on-ones, especially if you're in a bigger group. Somebody asks you a question, repeat the question for the audience, answer the question to the audience, and then check back in with the questioner to make sure that their answer is satisfactory. All right, folks, that brings me to the end of my piece here, certainly for this webinar. I'm going to hand it back to Anissa, and I thank you very, very much for your participation and your questions. I sincerely hope that you've got the value, or at least some of the value that you tuned in for. So, Anissa, back to you.
Thank you so much. This has been really helpful, and I've learned a lot as well. In fact, I wrote down a few of my takeaways. I'd love the folks on the call to type into your chat box any of your takeaways. Make it interactive to make it interesting. That was a really cool one. The pressure of the silence will inspire questions. And what in the world, Verdana and Helvetica were developed for PowerPoint? That's like the coolest thing ever I've learned. Had no idea. Love this piece about before I launch my PowerPoint, or before I jump into the PowerPoint, I launch my boat. And that one I wrote down and feel like, okay, plan it out. And then the last one I wrote down was identify my personal presentation weaknesses and plan for it before I ever begin. So Sherry writes, takeaway, start designing the presentation with the meat.
That's it.
And Sharon says this was extremely helpful. So I'm very jazzed about what you've presented today. And I know that we've had quite a few questions regarding how to get more of these presentation skills training. And I know you do a full day training for customized for individuals, for companies around sales, technical, and business. And I know that in those training, we have module 1 being foundational, a deeper dive into what you shared with us today, including video feedback, 8 hours of active learning, being able to produce productive question answer sessions, being able to really build a presenter's confidence, as well as learn how to gain and maintain that audience rapport, learn how to minimize that development time, not only using this system, but actually practicing it within the workshop. And then we also had some folks who've asked us about your train the trainer one. And my understanding is that the trainer's training one is module 2. So the prerequisite is the foundational one. That's module 1. That is deeper dive into what we learned today. And then the train the trainer becomes about the methodologies, accelerated learning, the roles of a trainer versus facilitator versus presenter versus keynote, the magic of learning the best practices in content delivery or facilitating discussions, which is an art in and of itself, to know how to be interactive in your presentations. And one of the things that Alan has and TurnKey has done is created a very customized approach to training that we are excited to offer. And for those on the call, or if you mentioned the webinar, we're extending a 20% off the presentation skills training. Now, Alan keeps his presentation classes very small. We're talking 5, maximum 6 participants, so that you can actually bring a presentation to the room and practice it, and then get peer feedback. And so by the time you leave this training, you literally have under your belt a presentation that you can move forward with, as well as those in your team. Now, the trainings that we do are on site. So we would be looking at coming to you, wherever you are in the U.S., to do the presentation skills training, and working with a few key leaders or key sales individuals, or those who are responsible for presenting technical data and supporting your organization in a customized approach for your presentation effectiveness goals. So Alan, anything about that we want to mention?
Yeah, it's learning by doing. I mean, you would have gotten a lot of hopefully useful information over the past hour, but nothing beats actually getting up and doing it. And that's why we only have 5, maximum 6 participants, because in a full 8-hour day, which goes really fast, by the way, it's all action. I show you how to build the thing in the first couple of hours. The rest of the day is presentation feedback, and we keep building and layering on the information we need to be effective in training. So, you know what, it's been the mainstay of my training practice now for 15 years. Delivered it all over the country, halfway around the world. It's a solid piece, and basically, you know, it's improvement guaranteed. We might have a slide at that at some point, but we will follow up with you. If anybody has challenged, you know, if they feel that a day isn't enough for them, you know, I will certainly make myself available on Skype post-training for those that aren't in Houston, and certainly available one-on-one. If anybody's like leaves the webinar or the training session, and they're not 100% saying this was the best darn training day I've ever had, then I'm making myself available to make sure at some point they're able to say that.
Thank you. I truly love that. I make it a goal for TurnKey's training to make a difference, or we put our money where our mouth is and we keep doing it
Yeah.
until we do. And that is something that you honor, and I really appreciate. So thank you everyone for being here. We would love to support you in your organization. Don't hesitate to reach out if we can brainstorm with you. If you have feedback for us, we would also love to hear. What other webinars would you like for us to put on? Do you have feedback about this webinar, things that we can improve? We are definitely open to hearing from you and want to. So thank you, Alan. I really appreciate
My
your
pleasure.
expertise sharing with us. And thank you everyone for being here.